there are so many different types of men and people in each of those types of men that have, let's say, like sub archetypes. And I think a lot of men look to the common examples of people in power, like those guys, or like a Donald Trump, Elon Musk. And a lot of men say, I don't relate to that, whether it's ethnically or racially, whether it's your socioeconomic status. And I'm curious from your experience working in DEI, what you've seen is some of the different messages different types of men receive based on who they identify as in the subtype of man, let's say, that they are.
For sure. And I appreciate that question, Wes, because it speaks to the core of who I am and how I show up in this work, right? As an Afro Latino man who is born in the States, product of a single parent home, has traversed many landscapes in his career. I am acutely aware of the experiences of someone like me and sort of how that trickles down across various areas of our lives. So, the first thing I would say with respect to being aware of that and how that differs is, and this might sound controversial, so, but I'm going to say it anyway because it does feel true to me. And that is, we're now in this world where there's a lot of conversation around men and boys being in crisis. And that is true writ large. The data supports it. We know it anecdotally. We are all, probably in community and in relationships with young men in various ways in our lives, whether cousins, brothers, etc. So we know that young men are in crisis. But my issue with that phrase and sort of that lens is that boys of color have been in crisis for a really long time, right? So if you're a man of color and you come from a certain community, you've known that you've been in crisis for a really long time. So what's changed and why this newfound interest in this conversation? And that's because in large part, it's now entered the white, the white men sort of ecosystem. And I'm not saying this to pull a race card or play sort of one versus the other, but it is important to acknowledge that young men of color have been in crisis in large part because of low resources, lower access to opportunities, mass incarceration, all of these systemic issues that affect the neighborhoods and the communities that we come from that then contribute to, whether it's the disproportionate representation of young men in college versus young women of young women of color in college, for example, or any other demographic. And I think it's important that we look at the structural issues that impact young men of color differently, not more, not less, but differently than young white men, and then address the root cause of that. One of the ways that they're similar is that there is just a lack of mentorship and a lack of leadership in our community from men. So there's been a call by more and more leaders for men like us, to mentor young men, especially men that are not in our community or in our families. There's something to be said about mentorship and you mentoring someone that's not related to you that is so powerful because the idea that they can see themselves reflected in you is the most, I would say for a young man, the most important unlock of ambition and vision for their own lives if they can see themselves represented in someone else. So, that's one sort of, common thread between various groups in terms of how we can show up better for young men. But I think there is an important conversation to be had about the structural issues, the lack of resources in school, the socioeconomic status that a lot of these young men are raised in that contribute to the ways that they evolve as men over time. So, without going into super deep, I mean, there's a lot of work out there in the space that talks about it. I'm no expert in the structural issues beyond sort of my own lived experience and my bit of work, but there are PhDs in this space that have done this work for years and years and years. I mean, Niobe Way is a great example of that. She's done a tremendous amount of work in her career, really unpacking the importance of looking at young men of color through a slightly different lens and addressing those specific issues in terms of giving them what they need. Last thing I'll say, and this is just, a term that we often throw around very loosely, but I think it's important to address, uh, especially given this conversation. There's a difference between equality and equity, right? Equality says everyone gets the same thing to be successful. Equity says, I'm going to take into account the disadvantages that this particular group had and give them what they need to be successful, which might be different than this group. Not saying that you have to take from one group to get to the other, but that equity is really important. So looking at it through the lens of equity, not equality, is one way, is an important way to really address this problem.
Yeah. I'm glad you named all that. Sadly, it could be controversial, but I don't think it is. And I don't think I think we should normalize that and call a spade a spade. I think you're right. And the biggest difference in that, and this is where I see people like you and our fellow brother Shanti Branch who are in the trenches doing the work, and why I resonate more with that, because I have found in a lot of, I don't want to call it white spaces, but among white people talking about men's issues, it tends to stay pretty like conceptual and ideological. And there's a lot of like, yeah, I don't know. Ethereal is the wrong word, but it
Well,
feels
there's a
like,
lot of theory, there's a lot of
yes,
diagnosing at a high level, there's a lot of
very high level
signaling, but not a lot of actual in the ground, getting your hands
behavioral.
dirty work. I love that you said that. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, and just something doesn't feel right about talking about a problem I'm not willing to be part of a solution in. And I think to your point, it's good that we're talking about it, but as we both know, that naming it is the first step. If you're not actually talking to men, if you're not actually understanding where they're struggling, and then you're not actually providing the resources, I think it starts with owning up to what you said, which is, hey, men have always been in crisis, with the caveat there are a particular type of men that have always been in crisis. And if that has been the case, then based on priority, it doesn't mean, to your point earlier, that we take resources from one group necessarily to fund another or help support another. But it does mean if that group has been struggling for longer and more intensely, then that deserves the priority of allocating the resources to at least give them the baseline, right? Because men who are white struggling, it's not that they don't experience similar discrepancies, but overall, like already at baseline and their struggle, right? So I think, I'm probably oversimplifying it, but I think we just need to name like, well, hey, we're a little hypocritical if we just are naming this newfound crisis with men, because we're ignoring a reality that's been the case. And to a degree, if we're honest, we probably have known and felt the need for change, but haven't been willing to contribute or paid attention to it, which there's no judgment necessarily, but there does need to be a certain level of accountability. I think my question to you then would be, okay, knowing this is a major need uh, in Black and brown boys, in particular, young men, one, what are the messages that you're hearing they're believing about what it means to be a man? And what have you found helpful in starting to provide some sort of mentorship and guidance in navigating those narratives to become healthier, more whole men?
Yeah, I would say that the first thing that comes to me is the idea that this is what I'm hearing from young men, is that the only path to success right now for them isn't even education, or isn't even getting a corporate job. Whereas maybe for other communities, that's still the vision, right? That might still be the path. For a lot of young men, particularly boys of color, the idea of getting an education and then getting a job doesn't feel attainable nor appealing. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is creating your own thing, right? So, the sense of entrepreneurship, the sense of really creating it on your own. There's this term that we use in our community, getting it out the mud, right? Getting it out the mud means just, figuring it out, right? Like looking at your resources and saying, what can I do? Whether it's through my art, through my ingenuity, my sense of innovation, my charisma, maybe turning on a mic and a camera, and I'm just going to find myself becoming a creator online and finding and building a community that way. So I think that out of a lack of opportunity comes resourcefulness. And so I think a lot of young men right now are trying to define for themselves, what does it mean to be successful? What does it mean to be a man, first and foremost? But then what does it mean to be a successful man? And then beyond that, what does it mean to provide? What does it mean to protect? And it's this conversation that's ever evolving right now, where what I'm finding, and this is the beauty of the work that we do, is that in the communities that we're starting to see a fundamental shift in the idea that the only way to provide is by getting a job and bringing the paycheck home every 2 weeks. Some young men are realizing by necessity in some cases that being a caregiver, right? Showing up for your family and taking care of your siblings is also a way to provide and to protect. I'm not saying that that's by choice. Oftentimes that happens because the parents are, at work and they're working the overnight shift, and the only adult in the house to care for their 9-year-old brother or sister is the 14-year-old kid that has to now make dinner and prepare them, make sure that they're doing their homework. Like, that level of caregiving oftentimes doesn't come, but it doesn't come by request, but it is a form of caregiving that I think is really shaping young men in a different way. And I can certainly relate to that for myself. I grew up, I have had to grow up really, really fast as the oldest of 7 kids, having to help my mom, single parent home. So that journey, that mentality, that mindset is very familiar to me. And it's not unique to me. It's very common in my community. So what I'm doing and the work that we're doing is to try to use that and shape that and morph that into a productive sense of vision, right? How do you build a life with that core foundation of resourcefulness, with that core foundation of care and integrity and responsibility that young men are developing at a young age?
There's this fascinating tension in society about how men are being treated. On one hand, we have devastating stats around male suicide, academic failure, unemployment, and isolation. And on the other hand, there seems to be a real palatable resistance to even naming these uh, issues as problems worth solving. What do you think the conversation around men's struggles has become? Why do you think it's become so polarized? And what's at stake in us figuring it out?
Yeah, I think to answer that question, let me take you back to the beginning in terms of when I started in this journey, in this work. So 2016 is when I launched the platform, The Lives of Men. And so at that time, it was the rise of the current social political landscape that we're currently in. You were also seeing the rise of sort of the Me Too movement happening and this conversation around toxic masculinity. And that's essentially when that phrase first entered our cultural vocabulary, right? We started to kind of use the phrase toxic masculinity as a catch-all phrase to describe what we have, for those of us who've been in the work for a long time, what we use to describe men's behavior, right? Or the stoicism, the lack of emotional intelligence, the increasing reliance on domination and power at the expense of other groups. In short, men behaving badly. Everything that kind of fell under that umbrella was what was labeled toxic masculinity, right? The womanizing, the abuse, all of these conversations that were happening at the time. So when you think about that being the genesis, that environment being the genesis of the ways that we've evolved since then in this conversation around men, you start to kind of notice a couple of things. First thing you notice is that there has been, by and large, a laziness around naming the root sources of what ails men nowadays, right? If we're talking about men, not having the emotional intelligence, the connectedness to their emotions, their humanity, and the ways that that shows up in violence, in domination, in power, in toxic masculinity, as it were. I think that, because of the ways that we're used to talking about this in culture, we've lost our way in talking about the root causes of that. What causes men to behave in these ways? The second thing that happened was that there was over time, an overcorrection of sort of how we penalized men coming out of that movement. It became sort of a way to cancel men, right? Or to cancel anything that was counter to what society labeled good, healthy behavior. And so what's transpired since then is that men have sort of been put on the margins, if you will, relegated to the margins and been told, shut up. We don't want to hear from you. You've been in power for far too long. Now this is an age of a new a new dynamic, a new paradigm to emerge. And so that's created this sense, this echo chamber where men feel isolated. They feel like they don't have a voice. They feel chastised and they feel like they don't really have a place in today's society that is rapidly evolving. And so those two things are what has, I think, contributed to this environment of, men not finding connection, not being in community with one another, falling behind by every metric. It's just been in part this overcorrection around how we've treated men and how we've relegated them to the margins since right around that 2016, 2017 time.
Yeah. Thank you for laying the foundation there of how we've essentially arrived to where we're at today. It's certainly not fully, but at least a runway. And I'm curious for the messages that guys are receiving. It obviously feels like where there's resistance, if someone is closed off to even seeing these things as problems, in my estimation, it doesn't seem very helpful or worthwhile to try to dialogue with them if they're not open to change, and that the effort should be towards supporting the men who are struggling, trying to get them to name those messages and even be honest about it. Like, hey, this is how I actually feel. This is what I actually believe. I think there's a real shame that guys think, well, what's wrong with me? Or if everyone else is kind of pointing this finger, then maybe I'm the one that needs to quote unquote get over it. So, how do you help guys start to at least name, like, hey, I do believe this message. I'm living it out through my belief, and how do we replace it with a new, more helpful narrative?
Yeah, I agree and I disagree in some ways with what you said in terms of I agree that there is value in focusing on the men who are already on this journey, who are already of a certain consciousness, and engaging them in a conversation around what does it mean to be a man, a healthy man, a more progressive, modern man, right? Who is fully embodied in his emotional experience, who is aware and self aware of how he shows up in the world, both in his personal and professional lives. I think there's value there for sure. But I think that there is increasingly more impact to be had when we're talking to men who aren't in this sort of in this wavelength. Because, and you asked me earlier what's at stake. I do think that what's at stake is the state of our planet, the state of our democracy, because in large part what you're seeing in society right now is caused by a version of masculinity that is holding on and clinging to power and to dominance and refusing to let go of that and creating scarcity in what we all know to be a naturally abundant world. So if we can find a way to reach common ground with those men, whether they're in the highest ranks of society or not, I think we'd all be better off. And so I think there is a conversation to be had there. And so if the question is how do we connect with those men, part of it is for those of us who are already in this ecosystem of conversation around what it means to be a man and have done a certain level of work in that space, is that we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, how do we need to evolve? How do we need to um, develop new language to connect with men that don't have the language that we have, right? How do we connect them with them through, the very sort of the things that they care about on a daily basis, right? A lot of men just care about putting food on the table, keeping a roof over their heads, and taking care of their families. So if we were to approach them with the full understand that you may not be talking about sort of understanding the intersectionality of this conversation, but we do understand the fears and the real concerns that come with you taking care of your family. And by the way, here's how you can take care of your family that don't involve you being a financial provider. You can do the work to self-regulate. You can do the work to tap into your emotions so that you show up as a safer space in that family home. I think that's a conversation worthwhile having. So I think, yes, there is impact to be had with those of us that are already in this work. But that's marginal. I think that the real impact to be had if we do the work, those of us that are in the work, is to think about how we approach it for those brothers who are not sort of aligned or not in the same wavelength, because the stakes are high. This is I don't want to be hyperbolous, It might sound a little bit out there in terms of why I think this work is so important, but it is. I do believe that if men have been in positions of power for eons, then I think it's also our responsibility for us to create a new paradigm and a new cultural technology for us moving forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Um, and to be more specific, I should have clarified more so speaking to those who are shut off or closed down, who are not men, who are essentially are adverse to seeing male problems as worth addressing.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah, so Ross Raquetto, who I also had, who we both know, was talking about this and that that a lot of specifically people on the left have that aversion to men, and he was talking about politically how that has impacted voting, et cetera. And he has this new approach where he's essentially saying like, hey, you of course as an individual you're entitled to your own beliefs, but essentially don't get in the way of those who are trying to make a difference and who are open to seeing the potential change in men. And I think that's a good thing to name no matter what you believe is one thing to hold that belief. I think it's another to unintentionally, for sure, unintentionally let it impede the effects on it. And I do agree. I think that it's not hyperbole because these types of ideologies are still garnering attention. And as we know, attention is the most impactful resource that we have. You know, it reminds me, just the other day, I have he's 18 now, year old client, boy, he's senior in high school. And I was just asking him, you know, how his week's been, et cetera, normal stuff, right? And then he says, hey, I have a random question for you. I said, okay. He said, I saw this video by this guy, Nick Fuentes, who I didn't know who this guy was until recently. And then, yeah, a lot of issues there. For those who are listening, please do not support any work that he does. But, anyways, he was like, I saw this video about like depression, and it was his take on that. And then here's what he said. And I'm curious what you think. And we talked through it. And then at the end, I told him, listen, you know, more importantly than what this guy is saying, it's important that you are discerning what is true and what is trustworthy. And the fact that you had a question that something was off there and you brought it to someone like me, I feel honored that you would. And it sounds like you're in agreement. I'd be curious at how you help a guy navigate discerning those, because I think especially if you're a younger guy listening, it's you're so malleable in believing these certain cultural messages, and you could know deep down that that is wrong. But again, it's so sinisterly like attractive. Like there's something gravitational about it. And I'm curious how we can start to address that and like take that power away through that dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, you're naming it and hitting it right on the nose. These people are charismatic and they're energetic and they look like these young men, right? And so that's captivating, that type of storytelling. So I can understand why young men feel the pull, the gravitational pull to that type of content. And I think that speaks to two things. Before I answer your question, I think it speaks to the idea that there aren't enough of us, you and I, out there, with these podcasts, with these platforms that are being elevated in a responsible way to create the counter narrative to those conversations and to those characters. So that's number one. And then number two, it speaks to what I said earlier about the laziness that we in this work have sort of settled into. So for me, and I'm in therapy, I've been in therapy for the large part of my adult life. And one of the most important things that I've learned that I think is the answer to your question for me is learning how to ask, is this true for me? First and foremost, before I respond, before I react, is this true for me? So if I'm consuming a piece of content or if someone's sharing a perspective, and to your earlier point about, the left, the right, and the entire political spectrum and how people feel so ingrained in their views nowadays and so polarized in those views, the most important thing we can do and the most important thing a young man can do is ask himself, is this true for him? Because in taking that moment of pause, what will happen is that you're going to overlay what you just consumed with your specific lived experience, with your set of values, and with your ambitions. And then you're going to have to make a decision at that point. Is this true for me? And is this who I want to become? Or is this someone who represents me? And is this the person that I want to become moving forward or not? And then at that point, hopefully, you and I are present in this young man's life in some way, either through content, through an experience, through a podcast, whatever it is, through a relationship where we can support him in making that decision that's healthier for him. And I think that's what's missing, right? It's not only the signals are out there, but then it's what does he do with the signal, right? And how does he self-author his journey that feels more authentic to him, in light of all of the pressure, right? Because right now, I mean, you and I probably know and can name them off the top of our heads in terms of the positive outlets and the men who are doing this work that are great messengers. But I would say that the more popular ones are the Andrew Tates, are the Nick Fuentes of the world who are you have millions of followers. They have this lifestyle on social media that feels attractive, and I think that's hitting on a couple other things that we're not naming right now in terms of how men have fallen back or young men have fallen back that really appeals to that wound. But I do think that it starts by asking the question, is this true for me? And then going from there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It seems like there's something within what they represent that feels meaningful. And to the young man listening, it's a false sense of being seen. And like, he gets me, or that's something that I want and I feel like I could achieve. But, these messages don't tend to be universal. Your story is so powerful because it shows young men who have similar experiences to you and who identify with you with a different way of going about it, and that's one of the things that trauma is so sinister about is it robs you of the ability to see beyond the trauma and what's happened to you, and you lose the ability to see potentiality and a future, and you get stuck in this vicious cycle of just the day-to-day grind and this fight or flight survival mode, which is real for a lot of people. And I'm curious, you mentioned your particular experience growing up, having to grow up too soon. What were some of the messages you believed then about what it means to be a man? And what were the exposures or the things that you experienced that help you change that narrative to see it differently?
Great question. The truth is that a lot of my signals and a lot of my lessons around what it meant to be a man came from my mother. And, I had men in my life. I had my uncle, I had some other folks in school. I was involved in sports, so I had coaches, etc. But none that were a consistent presence enough to make an impact and help form and shape my sense of direction around what it meant to be a man. Observing my mother, seeing her work 2 shifts back to back, providing for us by any means necessary, bringing food on the table, making sure that she would sacrifice to put us in these extracurricular programs, and at the same time, finding some time for joy for herself, for me, sort of created this idea that if she could do it, then me as a man with better command of the English language, with a better education, and quite frankly, male privilege, right? The fact that I'm a man in this world, there is privilege there, even though I am a black man. That sort of shaped my view around, well, there's nothing I can't do. And it created the sense of uh, the standard, I would say, in my relationships, in my romantic relationships, in which I would enter relationships and I would look at my partners and then compare them to my mom and be like, well, my mom did more with less. How is it possible that you're doing this with more? And so that was unfair, of course, but that was my formative experience in forming my own sort of container for what I wanted to be. And then you fast forward, and I'm sorry, I forgot the last part of the question.
No, you're good. It seemed like your mom set that understanding what it meant to be a man, but what were the experiences and things that exposed you to a new, let's say, more true narrative of what it actually meant to be?
Yeah. So some of the experiences that I had just coming out of that, so outside of the home. So in the home, I was getting these lessons and these signals from my mother. Out of the home, I was learning by trial and error and making a lot of mistakes. And like any young man in my group of friends, and so, but I had the benefit of a couple of people that I can think as we're talking about it that are just coming to mind that really made an impact in my life. One was my fifth grade teacher. His name is Mike Smith. Shout out to Mr. Smith. I don't know where you are. He's from Chicago, but he taught in the Bronx at the time. But he was the first person that I saw in a position of authority that looked like me, right? Same skin tone. He would show up to school with, these really powerful dashikis on, like very black pride, very like rooted in his identity. So he was the first person that taught me that it was okay to be me. So I can't thank Mike enough, Mr. Smith. And then the other person I would say is my uncle. My uncle is one of two boys in my mom's set of siblings. She's the oldest of eight, and she's got two brothers. My oldest uncle, and he was such an inspiration and such a support system in terms of helping me develop a sense of ambition, right? So think back. This is an immigrant family that has come from the Dominican Republic to the United States. He's the first boy to be here, the oldest boy, before my grandfather even came. And so he was tasked to help my mom establish a foundation for my family to come and thrive in the US and New York. And so he developed a sense of ambition from a very young age. And so he was the person that inspired me to think about my career beyond a craft or a vocation. He was like, no, you can be a finance professional. You can be this, you can be that. And he inspired me to think about wealth creation. He was the first person that inspired me to invest in real estate. So I think from a formative standpoint, from an example standpoint, those are two examples that really shaped me outside of the home as well.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing those. And what I'm struck by is the absolute reality and truth that your mom represented a real way to be a man without her herself being a man. And I think that points to the exact issue we fall into, which is this rigid understanding of the qualifiers of who can emulate manhood, or let's say masculinity in a sense. And shout out to her in so many ways of, making sure you got the best life she could give you, and that it seemed like stop at nothing to provide that. And frankly, they don't make them like that anymore. It's like there's so many, there's this pervasive thought, man, in our society where even parents, it's like me, me, me. It's all this shit about like, it all has to just be like, I'm only looking out for me. And I think I'm just so struck by it seems like her seemingly endless sacrifice to continually take care of you all, but not just take care of you, but within that, not use the stress she was experiencing as an excuse to not emulate a healthy model for you. And I don't know if she's alive today, but 100% would know she's proud of you and the man you've become, and certainly should take a good amount of credit for that. And then with your
Thank you, Wes.
uncle, yeah, man, absolutely. And, with your uncle, what I was really struck by is the fact that, he also just kind of not took orders and played that role, but it seemed like matter of fact, like this is just what I need to do for my family. But he himself was obviously exposed to some ways of thinking beyond the current grind. You mentioned, how to accumulate wealth and see beyond your current status. And it seems like that was such a simple message, but it seemed like it really hit deep in something you had never heard before. And for anyone out there listening, I think that just speaks to something that seems very obvious to you, may not be obvious to someone else. And that could be life changing, your ability to be generative with the wisdom and insight that you've learned. And then with your teacher, I just respect that he seemed like he was fully himself and he expressed himself and did not apologize. And I think that kind of healthy confidence and just this kind of matter of fact, I am who I am and I deserve a space in the world, really touched you and in your own self, help you believe the same for you. And I think going back to the mentorship, it's really all pointing back to that of who am I looking at, mostly subconsciously, of what to emulate? Because as kids, we will emulate something and someone. We are becoming a person. And what that person looks like is determined on the influences in our life. So, man, it's a real testimony to see you here today still express in some ways parts of who each of those people were to you in a way that's true to you, but also kind of carries the torch in a way that continues in a way that you're passing it on today. And it leads me to my next question. Speaking about education, there's been such a focus in school about, sit down, shut up, study, and just get the grades and move on. And to your point earlier, that narrative is broken because it doesn't work and it doesn't account for more impactful experiential things like emotion regulation. And you created a curriculum for the New York City Department of Education that treats psychological and emotional development as foundational, just as essential to things like algebra and biology. But as we both know, the education system it's broken and it's just trying to put people into a system and not attribute different various factors in success. And I'm curious what you think it actually looks like to rebuild education, and we can include beyond the classroom into online and experiential learning. What it actually looks like to rebuild that around the premise of learning to be a healthy human holistically instead of just attributing to learning certain subjects.
Yeah, look, I think we would be way better off as a society if we reoriented our education system to produce better human beings, better human leaders than we were in focusing on producing doctors and lawyers and accountants and all of that. I think all of that is important and we need it, but how much better off would we be as a society if we focused on developing the full human? And so, what do I mean by that? I've always been of the mind that the foundational element of a good leader is empathy. It's self awareness first, but then being empathetic. Everything else you can learn. You can learn the math, you can learn the strategy, you can develop a creative sensibility. But if you're not self aware and if you don't have empathy for others or don't have the ability to empathize with others and read the room and sort of develop those quote unquote softer skills, then you're dead in the water, right? Being able to connect and relate to people and hold space for people and read the room. And so I believe that our education system could do a lot more in helping young people develop their EQ as much as they do their IQ. In the ways that I look at that and why I've focused on this so deeply is because when you look at what I think young people are missing, they're missing structure and they're missing a philosophy or a way to arrive at their philosophy of success and of self authorship. So, to address that, the Lives of Men, we've developed a program called the Manuscript, specifically for young men and boys, but it is a human leadership program. And it's rooted in what we have as our strategic pillars of what we call healthy masculinity. So it's presence, purpose, power, partnership, protection, and play. So those six P's are the backbone, if you will, of what we believe are a code, right? When you talk to young men, there's this idea of having a code, right? A set of principles that you live your life by. Those six P's help us really cast a wider view around the areas of our lives that are important, in addition to academics. But I think the academic piece will come once there is a grounded nature in who that young man is. So we try to do work in helping them develop an understanding of what their purpose is. What does presence mean? What does it mean to be present in your life and in your community? What does power mean, and how do we redefine power? Not from a sense of dominance, but from a place of agency, right? Self agency. We talk about protection, right? As it's a fundamental driver of what we call masculinity. But what does that actually mean? We talk about partnership. It's the understanding that a life well lived happens in relationship with one another. And then the last P is play, is let's not forget that we need to consistently put ourselves in a place of play and childlike activity so that we can tap into these other parts of our brain that are less sort of logical and more creative in nature, and then introduce levity into our lives, right? Not everything needs to be serious. And I think those six P's taken together are what we think are the foundation of what then leads to educational success in the traditional sense.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Jason. I'm curious what led to arriving at those 6 P's, because what comes up for me is an appreciation that you haven't thrown the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense of, it seems like, let's use protection, for example. There's just a common, not necessarily absolute, but common narrative, feeling for men to feel like they need to provide. And if we just tell men, oh, that doesn't apply, you have to, a lot of men don't feel resonant. So I appreciate how you're essentially naming, hey, this is a common thing that a lot of guys experience, but let's reframe it to give it a more true definition and understanding. And through your relational dialogue, you're helping them reframe a way that names the common experience, but doesn't necessarily leave it there as true. So I'm curious how you arrived at those 6 P's as maybe a core sense of what a man could focus on.
Yeah, I think for us was to your point, and I love the phrase, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, let's ground it in what already feels natural to men. How do we already speak? How do we already think about things? And so it appeals to natural male psychology. We don't want to introduce things that aren't, that don't feel natural. So once we introduce it in that framework, then the idea is how do we start to apply just a different lens to these common phrases, these common ideas, if you will, and then expand their aperture around what they can consider as embodiment. How do they embody these things? So, one of the tools that we use is something we call the intention scale. And at the core, when you see it, it's just Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's to the degree that we can get to in our intention scale is sovereignty, the idea of self-actualization. At any point in time, you can be, and at any point during the day, you can be anywhere along that intention scale. But the intention scale is designed to not only name the thing, right? Name the feeling. We give it we quantify it. So we give it a from a -7 to a +7, but then we also give them language to identify the feeling in their bodies. What does this actually feel like in your body? So now we're creating this dynamic where if the conversation right now around men and boys is that we don't have the language, we're giving them the language, we're giving them sort of the analytical connection to how you measure it with the scale, but then we're also giving them the opportunity to identify what it feels like in their body. And I think that's really unique, right? It's not just saying you need to be more vulnerable. What if they don't understand what vulnerability means? What if they don't know what it feels like in their body? So it really is sort of integrating all of these frameworks into one.
Yeah, and it reminds me of dialectical behavioral therapy, emotion regulation, and the awareness stage, which is exactly what you're getting at. You know, emotions are just different types of energies that we need to learn to understand, but they're temporary states. But you know, this is a common thing that most of us men experience, is being out of touch with our body. We just let the emotion overtake us, let alone probably don't think we're being emotional. And I always, kind of make this joke. If you see a guy watch a sports game and you see how he yells at the TV, you can very easily see that he's emotional, right? Or if something happens where he feels violated and the way that he responds, like those are emotional moments. But we don't normalize those. And we certainly don't stop and help them process it. And it seems like you help guys slow down and say, okay, wait a minute, like, okay, you feel anger. What's the anger like? If you were to give it like a persona, okay, where's it showing up in your body? And then what do you want to do about it? And it seems like that language that you're providing, which ironically goes back to this education conversation, at the core, this is teaching and this is learning. It's going step by step. And instead of telling people what to think, we teach them how to think. And it seems like that's the work you're doing with these young men, is you're not saying, okay, feel angry, don't feel angry. It's bad, it's good, push it down, fully express it.
Right.
But you're just getting curious, you're getting present, and you're being with them through that experience so they feel safe enough just to be where they're at, instead of feeling like I already have to have my stuff figured out before I come into this experience, or I can't feel this emotion because, you know, who knows what's going to happen or what I'm going to do with it.
Yeah, and I would even go a step further and say, even with anger, right? Anger, I think we could both agree that is the emotion that's widely identified with what it means to be a man. But anger on its own isn't negative, right? So when you think about what anger is yes, it's a fiery emotion that signals to you that something's wrong and something's not aligned with what you believe, how you feel, how you see something. But when it gets out of control and it gets into rage, that's different, right? So it's really helping young men understand that there's a difference even within anger between anger and rage and how you control it. And I think oftentimes the bridge between those two isn't naming it, to your point. It's how do you name it in your body? Am I feeling something that's bubbling up for me? And how can I develop a mechanism to course correct and regulate that emotion?
100%, man. And I think this is true for all the P's that you mentioned, but another one is power, right? We've been told it's bad to have power. You've been in power too long. But the reality is, we all have power. It's what you do with it. We all have presence. It's what you do with it. It's how you're responsible as a person for all these things that are innate to who you are. And it's not bad that you get angry. It's how you express the anger. I mean, that's just right on the money, man. I think if we can teach guys to get out of this all or nothing thinking and this perfectionism or shame, like I'm either the worst or I'm just, the best, that's what's going to heal. And I'm curious, this is my last question. If, seeing who you are now and hearing your story, I imagine in some ways it feels like you're worlds away from that little boy in the Bronx. And yet there's probably a really true part of you that feels like that couldn't be more central to who you are and your experience. I'm curious who you are now as a man. What are some things you would tell that little boy that he needed to hear, and that would help him stick with it?
Man, that is at the risk of getting emotional, man, this is it's the question right there. I would say that, yeah, when I close my eyes and I think about who I am right now and the person that you're looking at versus the person that I close my eyes and see are two different people. I close my eyes and I still very much see 8-year-old Jason on his birthday playing with the new Voltron set that he got for as a gift, and knowing, in hindsight, knowing that that was the last birthday that I was ever gonna have as a child. Because since then, my life has completely shifted, and there's just been this theme of constant growth and maturity. Sometimes, I didn't ask for, but, here we are. So that internal idea, that internal image of who I am is still very much 8-year-old Jason. Even though I am a 6'4", take up space, all of that, a man today, I still have that in me. Not because I'm a little boy, growing up and moving around in a man's body. Definitely no Peter Pan syndrome here, right? But it really is, just a reminder of the constant work that I have to do to make sure that I'm caring for myself with the utmost tenderness and love and care. I mean, I think that to me has been one of the biggest unlocks in my adult life is, there's nothing wrong with having that inner child still live in you. And it's just my responsibility to continue to hug that kid and tell him that he belongs, tell him that he's valued, that he's seen, that he's heard. And so if I had to tell him something now, looking back, I would say, trust yourself. Trust in who you are. Trust in the fact that if you are in the room, you deserve to be in that room. And even if you don't feel like you're supported, even if you don't feel seen in a particular place, you still matter. And that to me is probably the most important advice that I would give that young man today.
I will not add anything because I think that's the exact message that I am receiving and telling myself. And for any guy out there, you need to hear and speak that over you. And Jason, while I'm sure you wouldn't wish it on anyone to go through the things you did in the way that you did, there's a strange gratitude for who you became in it and how it's allowed you to do the work that you do today and to be generative with your life and your experience in a way that helps other young men make sense of things. And certainly in this conversation has been incredibly helpful and insightful for giving the person that you are in a way that, otherwise we would not have this immense value. So thank you for trusting yourself, for sticking with it, and for coming to the conversation today and speaking out of that place.
Thank you, Wes. Thanks for creating the space and the container. And I'm just grateful to be on this journey with you, with men like you who are doing the work, who care so deeply. And so I'm incredibly grateful and excited to one, see this out in the world and see how people respond to it.
Yes, thank you, brother. And guys, we'll put Jason's information in the show notes, his website, Lives of Men, and all the amazing work that he's doing. And we'll see you next time.